The day I found myself setting up a folding cot next to the water heater in my own basement, listening to my daughter Gabrielle argue upstairs about which of my bedrooms would make the better nursery, I knew I had let things go too far. What she didn't know was that while she was planning to inherit my little house, I was quietly running a billion-dollar empire from my laptop, and her greed was about to cost her everything. At 73 years old, I never imagined I'd be living like a displaced refugee in the basement of the home my late husband Archie and I had built with our own hands 45 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The concrete walls seemed to close in around me as I hung my few remaining clothes on a makeshift rod strung between two support beams. Above my head, footsteps thundered across what used to be my kitchen floor, accompanied by Gabrielle's sharp voice directing her husband Gary where to move furniture that had been mine for decades. "Mom's old stuff can go to storage," I heard her say, her words carrying clearly through the thin basement ceiling. "We need to make room for the baby's things. She won't need all this space anyway. She's getting older, and it's better if she's closer to the laundry room in case she has accidents." Accidents? As if I were some doddering old woman who couldn't control her bodily functions. The humiliation burned in my chest, but what hurt more was the casual dismissal in her voice. To Gabrielle, I had become nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed, a burden to be tucked away in the basement while she claimed the life I had built. I sat down heavily on the narrow cot, a camping bed that Gary had grudgingly set up for me after I'd spent 3 nights sleeping in my reading chair and looked around at what had become my world. Cardboard boxes labeled "Mom's Stuff" were stacked against one wall, containing the remnants of a lifetime that Gabrielle had deemed unnecessary. Photo albums, books, my late husband's fishing trophies, my grandmother's china, all of it reduced to storage because it didn't fit with her vision of the home she was taking over. The water heater hummed beside me, a constant mechanical companion in my exile. I could smell the musty dampness that no amount of dehumidifying could completely eliminate. Feel the chill that seeped through the concrete foundation despite the space heater Gary had plugged in for my comfort. This was supposed to be temporary, they'd said. Just until they could find a place of their own. Just until they got back on their feet after Gary lost his job. Just until the baby arrived and they could figure out their next steps. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of gradually being pushed out of my own spaces. First, it was just the guest bedroom for Gabrielle and Gary. Then they needed the second bedroom for the nursery. Then my home office became Gary's job hunting headquarters. Then my sewing room became storage for baby supplies. Each concession seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they had orchestrated my complete displacement from the life I had known. "It's actually perfect down there," I heard Gabrielle telling someone on the phone, probably her sister Karen, who lived 3 states away and visited twice a year. "She has her own bathroom and we put in a little kitchenette. It's like her own apartment. Plus, she's right there if we need help with the baby." Her own apartment. The words were carefully chosen to make my banishment sound like a gift, a thoughtful arrangement designed for my benefit rather than theirs. But I knew the truth. I was being stored like the boxes around me, kept accessible but out of sight, available when needed but otherwise forgotten. What Gabrielle didn't know, what none of them knew, was that during those long hours in the basement while they lived their lives upstairs, I hadn't been sitting idle. While they assumed I was napping or watching old movies on the small television they'd grudgingly provided, I had been working, building, creating something that would have shocked them speechless if they'd bothered to pay attention. The laptop, bag beside my cot, contained more than just a computer for playing solitaire and checking email, as Gabrielle assumed. It contained the control center of Meridian Digital Solutions, the company I had quietly built over the past 5 years into a billion-dollar empire. While my daughter saw only an aging widow whose best days were behind her, I had been leveraging decades of business experience, and the nest egg Archie had left me into something extraordinary. It had started small, as these things do. After Archie's death, I found myself with too much time and too much nervous energy. The financial advisor managing our investments had suggested I might want to consider some more aggressive strategies, given my age, and the fact that I had no real dependents. "Live a little," he'd said. "You can't take it with you." Instead of cruise ships and luxury cars, I had discovered the world of digital commerce. What began as a curiosity about online business had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of e-commerce, digital marketing, and strategic acquisitions. While my contemporaries were learning to video chat with their grandchildren, I was learning to read quarterly reports and evaluate startup companies. Meridian Digital Solutions was my masterpiece, a holding company that acquired struggling online businesses and transformed them into profitable enterprises. I had started with 3 small companies purchased with a portion of Archie's life insurance money. Within 2 years, I had a portfolio of 15 businesses. Within 4 years, I was acquiring companies worth millions. Now, my empire spanned everything from specialty manufacturing to software development, from logistics companies to online retail platforms. The beautiful irony was that I had hidden in plain sight. When family members asked about my computer time, I simply said I was keeping busy with some online shopping and email. When packages arrived regularly at the house, I explained them as ordering supplies and gifts online. When I received business calls, I claimed they were from telemarketers or wrong numbers. Everyone was so eager to dismiss the old woman that no one looked closely enough to see what was really happening. Now, as I sat in my basement exile, listening to Gabrielle plan the life she intended to build on my foundation, I realized that the time for hiding was coming to an end. Tomorrow, according to the conversation I'd overheard, Gary would be asking me for money again. A loan that we both knew would never be repaid, just like the previous 3 loans I'd provided over the past year. They saw me as their personal bank, a resource to be tapped whenever their poor financial decisions caught up with them. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, when they came to the basement looking for another handout from the old woman they'd stashed away, I would show them exactly who they had been taking advantage of. I would reveal that their basement-dwelling burden was actually one of the wealthiest women in the state, and their greed had just cost them more than they could possibly imagine. There was a time when this house had been filled with laughter, purpose, and respect. When Archie was alive and our children were young, these walls had witnessed birthday parties and holiday celebrations, homework sessions at the kitchen table, and late-night conversations on the front porch swing. I had been the heart of this. Home then, not its forgotten occupant. Archie and I had purchased this property in 1978 when Gabrielle was just 3 years old and Karen was still a baby. It wasn't much then, a modest 2-story colonial on half an acre in what was considered the outskirts of Millbrook Township. But we had vision. Archie worked construction during the day and spent his evenings and weekends transforming our house into something special. I managed the household budget with mathematical precision, stretching every dollar so we could afford the improvements that would turn our house into a home. I had been good with numbers even then. While other wives in the neighborhood handed over financial decisions to their husbands, I was the one who managed our investments, tracked our expenses, and planned for our future. Archie always said I had a head for business that was wasted on housekeeping, but in those days, a woman's place was clearly defined. I channeled my analytical mind into making our family's money work harder than anyone thought possible. By 1985, I had parlayed our careful budgeting and strategic home improvements into enough equity to help Archie start his own construction company. While he built houses, I built the business side, handling contracts, managing payroll, negotiating with suppliers, and keeping the books. Morrison Construction became one of the most respected builders in 3 counties, not because of Archie's craftsmanship alone, but because of the solid financial foundation I had created behind the scenes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The girls had grown up in this house, understanding that their mother was not just a homemaker, but a partner in their father's success. I had attended every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play, but I had also been the one to review construction bids at the kitchen table after dinner, the one to handle crisis calls from job sites, the one to make strategic decisions about which projects to take and which to decline. When Gabrielle was 16, she used to bring friends home after school, and I would overhear them talking. "Your mom is so cool," they would say. "She actually runs a business. My mom just stays home." Gabrielle would beam with pride then, explaining how I could read blueprints and negotiate contracts just like any man. She respected my intelligence then, valued my opinions, saw me as someone to emulate rather than someone to manage. Those were the days when family dinners meant animated discussions about current events, business strategies, and future plans. Gabrielle had inherited my analytical mind, excelling in mathematics and economics. Karen was more creative, but she appreciated the security that our business success provided. Both girls understood that their comfortable childhood, the nice clothes, the family vacations, the college funds that grew steadily, was the result of their parents' partnership and hard work. The house had reflected our prosperity. The kitchen, I had designed, featured custom cabinets and granite countertops that were luxurious for their time. The living room showcased Archie's craftsmanship with built-in bookshelves and a stone fireplace he had constructed by hand. My home office, with its organized filing systems and state-of-the-art computer equipment, had been the nerve center of our business operations. I remembered the pride I felt when hosting dinner parties for other contractors and their wives. While the men talked shop on the patio, their wives would often drift toward the kitchen where I was finishing dinner preparations. But invariably, the conversation would turn to business, and I would find myself explaining market trends, discussing new construction techniques, or sharing insights about regulatory changes that might affect the industry. These women looked to me for expertise, respected my knowledge, sought my advice on their own family businesses. Archie had been my biggest supporter in those days. "Lorna's the brains behind this operation," he would tell people without a trace of embarrassment. "I just hammer the nails where she tells me to." He understood that our success was built on mutual respect and complementary skills. He brought the technical expertise and client relationships. I brought the strategic thinking and financial acumen. When the girls left for college, Archie and I had enjoyed a golden period of empty nest freedom. We traveled extensively, visiting construction sites around the world to study different building techniques and architectural styles. I had started taking business courses at the local community college, ostensibly to keep up with modern practices, but really because I was hungry for more knowledge, more challenges, more ways to apply my mind to complex problems. The business had thrived under our partnership. By the time Archie was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2018, Morrison Construction had completed over 300 homes and generated enough wealth to ensure our comfortable retirement. We had investments, savings, life insurance, and a business that could be sold for a substantial sum when the time came. Even during Archie's illness, I had been the one managing the difficult decisions. Selling the business to our longtime foreman who had proven himself capable of maintaining our reputation, organizing Archie's medical care and insurance claims, planning for a future that would look very different from the one we had imagined, together. The respect I had commanded then felt like something from another lifetime. Gabrielle and Karen had both relied on my judgment during Archie's final months, recognizing that I was the one who understood the financial implications of every medical decision, every treatment option, every end-of-life choice we faced. I had been their rock then, the strong mother who held everything together while their father was dying. That woman, the successful businesswoman, the respected community member, the matriarch who commanded attention when she spoke, felt like a a stranger now. How had I allowed myself to become the basement-dwelling burden that my own daughter saw when she looked at me? How had the woman who once negotiated million-dollar construction contracts become someone who was grateful for a folding cot and access to a basement bathroom? The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but somehow it had been complete. The confident business owner had become the invisible old woman, and I was the only one who remembered that she had ever existed at all. The decline began 6 months after Archie's funeral, when Gabrielle first mentioned that she and Gary were having some financial difficulties. It seemed innocent enough at the time, a temporary setback that any young family might face. Gary had been laid off from his job at the marketing firm where he'd worked for 3 years, and with a baby on the way, they were struggling to make ends meet on just Gabrielle's teacher salary. "We might need to move back home for a few months," Gabrielle had said during one of our weekly phone calls. "Just until Gary finds something new. You know how tough the job market is these days." Her voice carried that particular tone that adult children use when they're asking for help, but trying to make it sound like they're doing you a favor. "It would actually be good for you, Mom. You've been so lonely since Dad died. Having us around might cheer you up." At the time, it had seemed reasonable. The house felt cavernous with just me rattling around in it, and the idea of having family close by during my first year of widowhood was appealing. I had imagined cozy evenings with my pregnant daughter, helping her prepare for motherhood the way my own mother had helped me. I pictured myself being useful again, needed, valued for my experience and wisdom. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly temporary would become indefinite, and how a few months would stretch into the better part of a year with no end in sight. The first sign of trouble came when Gary's job search proved less vigorous than advertised. Instead of spending his days networking and interviewing, he seemed to spend most of his time on the couch, laptop open but mostly browsing social media or playing online games. When I gently suggested some job search strategies based on my business experience, he bristled. "The job market is different now, Lorna," he'd said, using my first name in a way that felt deliberately dismissive. "It's all online algorithms and HR software. Your old-school networking stuff doesn't work anymore." He'd gestured vaguely at his laptop screen. "I'm working smarter, not harder." Gabrielle had defended him, of course. "Gary's being strategic about his search," she'd explained when I'd expressed concern privately. "He doesn't want to just take any job. We need something with good benefits and growth potential, especially with the baby coming." As weeks turned into months, their strategic approach yielded no results, but their comfort level in my home increased dramatically. What started as grateful guests helping with household chores gradually shifted to entitled residents who expected to be waited on. Gary stopped offering to cook dinner and started asking what I was making. Gabrielle went from helping with laundry to leaving her clothes in the washer for days until I either re-washed them or moved them myself. The financial requests started small. $20 for gas, $50 for groceries that somehow never materialized in my refrigerator, $100 for a job interview outfit for Gary that he wore exactly once. Each request came with elaborate explanations and promises of repayment as soon as Gary starts working again. By the time Gabrielle was 6 months pregnant, they had borrowed, though we all knew it wasn't really borrowing, nearly $3,000 from me. More troubling than the money, though, was the way they had begun treating my home as their own. Gary had commandeered my home office for his job search headquarters, which seemed to consist mainly of video games and YouTube videos. Gabrielle had started rearranging furniture and redecorating rooms to better suit her tastes. "This wallpaper is so dated, Mom," she'd said one afternoon, standing in the dining room with her hands on her hips, studying the floral pattern Archie and I had chosen together 15 years earlier. "We should strip it and paint something more modern. I saw this beautiful sage green color at the store that would really brighten up the space." The "we" in that sentence had been particularly galling. Since when had my decorating choices become a group decision? But I'd bitten my tongue, telling myself that pregnancy hormones might be making her more critical than usual. After all, she was dealing with a lot of stress between Gary's unemployment and the approaching baby. The breaking point came when their son Rudy was born. What should have been a joyful celebration became another opportunity for them to expand their territory in my home. Suddenly, my craft room needed to become the nursery. My reading nook was required for a changing station. My kitchen needed to be baby-proofed, which apparently meant removing or rearranging most of the items I use daily. "You understand, don't you, Mom?" Gabrielle had said while directing Gary to move my sewing machine out of the room they'd claimed for the baby. "We need space for all the baby gear, and it's easier if everything is on one floor so I don't have to carry Rudy up and down the stairs all the time." What I understood was that I was being systematically displaced from my own home, one room at a time. But every time I tried to voice concerns, I was made to feel selfish and unreasonable. Was I really going to prioritize my sewing over my grandson's comfort? Did I want to be the kind of grandmother who cared more about her reading chair than her daughter's convenience? The guilt was expertly applied. When I mentioned that I missed having my office space, Gary would point out how hard he was working to find a job. When I suggested that perhaps they should look for their own apartment, Gabrielle would remind me how expensive childcare was and how much money they were saving me by being available to help around the house. When I expressed frustration about constantly having to move my belongings to make room for theirs, they would exchange meaningful looks that clearly communicated their shared opinion. The old woman was becoming difficult. The final insult came when they announced that they'd decided to turn the basement into a cozy apartment for me. Gary had found some part-time work, finally, but it wasn't enough to afford their own place yet. They needed to optimize the space in the house to make the arrangement work for everyone. "Think of it as your own private suite," Gabrielle had said brightly, as if she were offering me a luxury vacation rather than banishment to the basement. "You'll have complete privacy down there. No baby crying at night, no one disturbing your routines. It's actually perfect for someone your age." Someone my age. At 73, I was apparently too old to deserve a bedroom on the main floor of my own home, too old to have an opinion about how my space was used, too old to expect respect from my own daughter. I had become an inconvenient elderly relative, to be managed rather than the woman who had built the foundation on which they were now standing. The most maddening part was how they'd convinced themselves, and tried to convince me, that this arrangement was actually beneficial for everyone involved. They got a free house and built-in babysitter. I got the privilege of being nearby to help with their responsibilities while staying out of their way. It was presented as a win-win situation, even though only one side was actually winning. Living in the basement became my new reality with alarming speed. What should have felt like temporary exile gradually transformed into an accepted arrangement that everyone, except me, seemed comfortable with. The boundaries of my diminished existence were established through a series of small indignities that accumulated like sediment, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, but devastating in their collective weight. The first boundary was physical. My access to the main floor became increasingly restricted, not through explicit rules, but through the constant presence of their belongings and activities. The living room was always occupied by Gary's job search materials, or Gabrielle's baby preparations. The kitchen became their domain, with my cooking relegated to times when they weren't using the space. Even my own dining room table was covered with their paperwork, baby catalogs, and Gary's laptop accessories. "Sorry, Mom," Gabrielle would say when I wanted to use my own kitchen. "I'm just starting dinner prep. Maybe you could eat a little later. Tonight?" Or Gary would look up from his computer at my dining room table and say, "I'm right in the middle of an important application. Could you use the TV tray in the basement tonight?" Each request seemed reasonable. They were the ones with a baby to feed, after all. Gary's job search was crucial for their future financial stability. My needs, cooking when I was hungry, eating at my own table, watching television in my own living room, were positioned as less urgent, less important, more flexible because I had all the time in the world. The erosion of my authority in my own home was even more insidious. Decisions about household matters were increasingly made without consulting me. When the cable company called about upgrading our service, Gary answered and made changes to my account without asking. When Gabrielle decided the thermostat setting was wrong, she adjusted it and told me after the fact. When they needed to have their friends over for dinner, they informed me rather than requesting permission. We invited the Hendersons for Saturday night, Gabrielle announced one Friday morning. I thought we'd grill out. Oh, and could you maybe stay downstairs that evening? Sarah Henderson can be a little judgmental about family situations, and it might be easier if she doesn't know about our living arrangement. The casual way she asked me to hide in my own basement so her friends wouldn't know her elderly mother lived there was breathtaking in its audacity. But by then, I had learned that objecting to their requests only led to lectures about being inflexible or not understanding how hard things are for young families today. My role in the household crystallized into something resembling an unpaid domestic worker who happened to live on the premises. I was expected to be available for babysitting whenever they needed to go out, but I wasn't consulted about their social calendar. I was supposed to contribute to household expenses. They never directly asked, but they frequently mentioned how expensive everything was getting. But I had no say in how money was spent. The financial exploitation became increasingly sophisticated. Instead of direct requests for cash, they began to borrow my credit cards for emergency purchases that were never paid back. Gary would use my card for gas, promising to reimburse me the next day, then act as if he'd forgotten when next day arrived. Gabrielle would put groceries on my account, claiming she'd accidentally grabbed the wrong card, then become defensive when I mentioned the charges. "I'm buying food for all of us, Mom," she'd say with exaggerated patience. "It's not like I'm spending your money on myself. We're a family. Families share expenses." But when I suggested they contribute to the utility bills that had nearly doubled since their arrival, they would remind me of all the ways they were helping me. Gary had fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, though he'd used my credit card to buy the parts. Gabrielle was handling all the grocery shopping, though she was using my money and buying foods I didn't eat. They were providing me with companionship in my grief, though most of our interactions consisted of them telling me what they needed me to do. The transformation of my identity was perhaps the most painful aspect of my diminished circumstances. I had gone from being Lorna Morrison, successful businesswoman and respected community member, to being simply Grandma Lorna, a convenient elderly relative whose primary value lay in her availability and resources. When the neighbors asked Gary about me, he would explain that I was getting older and needed help managing the house. When service providers called, Gabrielle would often answer and speak on my behalf, explaining that she was helping Mom with these decisions now. When mail arrived addressed to me, they would open it if it looked important, claiming they were just making sure nothing urgent got missed. My own daughter had begun to speak about me in the third person even when I was in the room. "Mom doesn't really understand technology," she'd tell Gary when I suggested a different approach to his online job applications. "She's from a different generation. Things work differently now." The most insidious part of this erosion was how it was all framed as care and concern for my well-being. When I protested about being excluded from decisions, they worried aloud about my increasing confusion and difficulty adjusting to change. When I expressed frustration about my living situation, they attributed it to depression following Dad's death, and suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about these feelings. Every legitimate complaint was pathologized. Every reasonable boundary was reframed as evidence of my declining mental capacity. Every assertion of my own preferences was treated as a symptom of some age-related deterioration that required their management and patience. The cruelest irony was that during this entire period, I was becoming more intellectually engaged and mentally sharp than I had been in years. The business I was building in secret required constant learning, strategic thinking, and complex decision-making. I was reading financial reports, analyzing market trends, negotiating acquisitions, and managing a growing portfolio of companies with a clarity and confidence that would have impressed my former business associates. But in my own home, I was treated as if I were becoming increasingly incapable of basic reasoning. The disconnect between my actual abilities and their perception of my decline would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating to experience daily. The moment that shattered my last vestige of denial came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, almost exactly 8 months after they had moved in. I had been in the basement, working on my laptop as usual, when I heard voices upstairs that didn't belong to Gabrielle or Gary. Curious, I climbed the stairs quietly and realized they were giving someone a tour of the house. "And this is the master bedroom," I heard Gabrielle saying, her voice bright with pride. "We completely redecorated when we moved in. The previous owners had really dated taste, but we've modernized everything." Previous owners. The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed myself against the wall at the top of the basement stairs, hidden from view but able to hear every word as they continued their tour with what I now realized were prospective buyers. "The kitchen has been completely updated too," Gary's voice carried from the front of the house. "New appliances, fresh paint, modern fixtures. We've really transformed this place from what it was." "What about the older woman?" I heard an unfamiliar female voice ask. "The neighbor mentioned that the owner's mother lives here." There was a pause, and I held my breath, waiting to hear how my own daughter would explain my existence to these strangers. "Oh, that's just temporary," Gabrielle replied dismissively. "She's been staying in the basement apartment while she figures out her next steps. She'll be moving to assisted living soon. We're just helping her transition. The basement could easily be converted to a rec room or home office once she's gone." Assisted living. They were telling people I was being moved to assisted living. Not only were they selling my house out from under me, but they were spreading the fiction that I was mentally or physically incapable of living independently. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. "The whole property will be ours, free and clear," Gary continued. "No liens, no complications. My mother-in-law owned it outright, but she's really not capable of managing it anymore. We've been handling all the maintenance and improvements. My mother-in-law owned it, past tense, as if I were already dead." I listened in growing horror as they continued the tour, discussing my home, my life, as if it were already theirs to dispose of. They showed off the improvements they'd made with my money, described the future renovations they planned to make, and answered questions about property taxes and neighborhood amenities with the confidence of people who had every right to be making these decisions. "We're asking $400,000, Gabrielle said as they moved toward the front door. "It's a steal at that price, especially with all the work we've put into it. Houses in this neighborhood don't come on the market very often. $400,000. For the house that Archie and I had paid off decades ago. For the property where we had built our business and raised our children. For the home that legally belonged to me and only me, since Archie had died before we'd updated the deed to include joint ownership." After the prospective buyers left, I remained frozen on the basement stairs, trying to process what I had just heard. My daughter and son-in-law were actively trying to sell my house. They had been showing it to potential buyers, discussing closing dates, and making plans for my future that involved moving me to an assisted living facility I had never agreed to consider. The most shocking part wasn't even the betrayal, though that cut deep enough. It was the realization of how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that this was not only acceptable, but necessary. In their minds, I had become such a burden, such an incapable old woman, that making these decisions for me was an act of kindness rather than theft. I finally understood that all of their talk about helping me, caring for me, and looking out for my best interests had been elaborate justification for what was essentially elder abuse. They had moved into my home under false pretenses, systematically isolated me from my own life, and were now planning to sell my property and institutionalize me so they could keep the proceeds. The woman who had once negotiated million-dollar construction deals was being treated like someone who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about where she lived or how she spent her money. The grandmother who had built a successful business from nothing was being described to strangers as a confused old lady who needed to be managed by her more capable adult children. As I sat in my basement that evening, staring at the laptop that contained the evidence of my secret success, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion that had plagued me for months crystallized into something much clearer and more powerful: righteous anger. They thought I was a helpless old woman whose assets they could claim and whose future they could determine. They had no idea that while they were upstairs planning to steal my house, I was downstairs running a business empire that was worth more than they could imagine. They assumed I was declining mentally and financially, unaware that I was actually at the peak of my intellectual and economic power. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. While they were congratulating themselves on taking advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman, that supposedly vulnerable woman was making business decisions that affected hundreds of employees and generated millions in revenue. Tomorrow, I realized, they would probably ask me for more money. Another loan to tide them over while Gary continued his half-hearted job search. Another contribution to household expenses that I had no say in incurring. Another request framed as help for poor young parents struggling to make ends meet. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would finally show them exactly who they had been stealing from. The next morning, I made a decision that I hadn't made in months. I left the house. Not to run errands or attend a doctor's appointment, the only excursions Gabrielle deemed necessary for someone my age, but simply because I wanted to remember what it felt like to exist in the world as an autonomous person rather than a basement dwelling burden. I drove to the Millbrook Township Library, a place I had frequented during my business building days, but hadn't visited since Gabrielle and Gary had moved in. The librarian, a woman named Samantha who had always been friendly during my previous visits, looked up with surprise and genuine pleasure when she saw me approach the reference desk. "Mrs. Morrison, I haven't seen you in months. How have you been?" The simple question, asked with authentic interest by someone who remembered me as a person rather than a problem to be managed, nearly brought me to tears. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being and actually wanted to hear the answer? "I've been adjusting," I said carefully, then found myself adding, "to some family changes." Samantha's expression shifted to one of gentle concern. "I hope everything is all right. You seemed so energetic and focused when you were coming in regularly last year, always working on those business research projects." Business research projects. She remembered. Someone in the world still saw me as the competent woman who had been building something meaningful, not just the declining elderly relative who needed constant supervision. "Actually," I said, making an impulsive decision, "I was wondering if I could use one of the private study rooms today. I have some important work to catch up on." "Of course. Room B is available all afternoon. I'll set you up right now." The private study room felt like a sanctuary. Away from the basement, away from the constant reminders of my diminished status, I could finally think clearly about my situation. I opened my laptop and, for the first time in weeks, allowed myself to really examine what I had built. Meridian Digital Solutions had grown beyond even my ambitious projections. The portfolio now included 23 companies across 6 different industries. Last quarter's revenue had exceeded $1.2 billion. The business intelligence software company I had acquired just 3 months ago was already showing signs of the transformation I had envisioned when I bought it. I was not just wealthy, I was running a business empire that would have impressed the most sophisticated investors on Wall Street. The woman who was supposedly too confused to manage her own household finances was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state. As I reviewed the latest quarterly reports, Samantha knocked gently on the study room door. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing. Are those corporate financials you're working with? I hesitated for a moment, then decided that I was tired of hiding. Yes, I run a business. Actually, several businesses. Her eyes widened as she caught a glimpse of the numbers on my screen. Mrs. Morrison, these figures? This looks like a substantial operation. You're running all of this yourself? I am, I said, and for the first time in months, I felt proud rather than apologetic about my accomplishments. That's incredible, Samantha said, settling into the chair across from me. I knew you were working on something significant, but I had no idea of the scale. How long have you been building this? About 5 years now, since my husband passed away. 5 years, she repeated, shaking her head in amazement. And you started this at 68, I said quietly. 68. Samantha leaned back in her chair, studying me with new respect. Mrs. Morrison, do you realize how extraordinary that is? Most people your age are thinking about retirement, and you've built what looks like $1 billion enterprise. Hearing someone else acknowledge the magnitude of what I had accomplished was like having a dam burst inside me. All the months of being treated as incompetent, of having my judgment questioned and my capabilities dismissed, had created a desperate hunger for recognition that I hadn't even realized existed. My daughter doesn't know, I admitted. Nobody in my family knows. They think I'm just playing around on the computer. Samantha's expression grew troubled. They don't know about any of this? About your success? They think I'm declining, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. They moved into my house because I supposedly can't manage on my own anymore. I'm living in the basement because they need the main floor for their family. They've been borrowing money from me for months, and yesterday I overheard them giving a tour to potential buyers. They're planning to sell my house and move me to assisted living. The look of shock and indignation on Samantha's face was both validating and infuriating. If a relative stranger could immediately see how wrong this situation was, how had I allowed myself to normalize it for so long? Mrs. Morrison, she said slowly, that's elder abuse. Financial abuse at the very least. You're being taken advantage of by people who should be protecting you. Elder abuse. The clinical term for what I had been experiencing made it sound both more serious and more common than I had realized. I wasn't just a family member having relationship difficulties. I was the victim of a crime. But they think they're helping, I protested weakly. They say I need assistance managing things. Do you? Samantha asked bluntly. Because from where I'm sitting, looking at what you've accomplished, you seem more capable of managing complex affairs than most people half your age. The simple validation hit me like a physical force. Someone could see what I could see, that I wasn't declining, wasn't incompetent, wasn't in need of the kind of management my family was imposing on me. What they're doing to you, Samantha continued, is based on their assumptions about aging, not on any evidence of your actual capabilities. They've decided you're too old to manage your own life, so they're taking control without your consent. That's not help, that's theft. Theft. Another word that made my situation sound as serious as it felt. The question is, Samantha said gently, what are you going to do about it? Samantha's question echoed in my mind for the rest of that afternoon and all through the evening. What was I going to do about it? For months, I had felt powerless, trapped by family obligations and social expectations about how elderly mothers should behave. But sitting in that library study room, surrounded by evidence of my own competence and success, I realized that feeling powerless and actually being powerless were two very different things. I had options. I had resources. I had capabilities that Gabrielle and Gary couldn't even imagine. The question wasn't whether I could change my situation. It was how I wanted to change it, and how dramatically I was willing to act. Over the next several days, I began researching my legal position with the same methodical approach I had used to build my business empire. I discovered that, since the house was solely in my name and I had never signed any power of attorney documents, Gabrielle and Gary had absolutely no legal right to make decisions about my property or my living situation. Their assumption that they could control my affairs was based entirely on my willingness to let them do so. More importantly, I learned that their attempts to sell my house without my knowledge or consent constituted fraud. The conversations I had overheard weren't just morally wrong, they were criminal. If they actually attempted to complete a sale, they would be committing felony theft of property worth nearly $500,000. The financial exploitation was equally clear-cut. The thousands of dollars in loans they had never repaid, the credit card charges they had made without permission, the household expenses they had shifted to me while excluding me from decisions, all of it constituted financial elder abuse, a crime that carried serious penalties in our state. But beyond the legal remedies available to me, I began to see opportunities for a more poetic form of justice. They thought they were taking advantage of a helpless old woman with limited resources. What would happen when they discovered that their victim was actually one of the wealthiest people in the county? I spent hours researching comparable situations, reading about other family financial disputes, studying how successful business people had handled betrayals by relatives. The pattern that emerged was clear. The victims who fared best were those who acted decisively, from a position of strength, before the perpetrators realized they had been discovered. The more I learned, the more I understood that my secrecy about Meridian Digital Solutions had actually given me an enormous tactical advantage. Gabrielle and Gary had no idea what they were really dealing with. They thought they were manipulating a vulnerable widow with limited means and declining faculties. They had no conception that they were actually attempting to defraud someone who could buy their entire neighborhood without affecting her quarterly cash flow. I also began researching assisted living facilities, not because I intended to move to one, but because I wanted to understand exactly what they were planning for my future. What I discovered was disturbing. The facilities they could afford on the proceeds from selling my house were institutional warehouses where elderly people were essentially stored until they died. The better facilities, the ones that offered genuine care and maintained residents' dignity, cost far more than the $400,000 they expected to get from my property. Even if their motives had been pure, even if they genuinely believed I needed care, their plan would have condemned me to a grim final chapter that no one deserved. But their motives weren't pure. The research I conducted into their personal finances, easier than it should have been since they conducted most of their business on my Wi-Fi network and Gary wasn't nearly as careful about cybersecurity as he thought, revealed the truth about their situation. Gary hadn't been laid off from his marketing job. He had been fired for poor performance after a series of client complaints about missed deadlines and unprofessional behavior. The strategic job search he had been conducting for months was actually just collecting unemployment benefits while playing video games and browsing job listings he had no intention of applying for. Gabrielle's teacher salary was sufficient to support their family, but Gary's spending habits had created substantial credit card debt that they were struggling to manage. They owed nearly $30,000 on various cards, and the minimum payments were consuming most of Gabrielle's take-home pay. Their plan was becoming clear. Use my house as collateral to eliminate their debt, move me to the cheapest possible care facility, and keep the remaining proceeds to fund Gary's continued unemployment. I wasn't just being abused. I was being systematically robbed to subsidize my son-in-law's laziness. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that I was dependent on them for financial survival, that without their help, I would be unable to afford housing or care for myself. They had no idea that I could write a check for the full amount of their debt without even noticing the expense, or that I generated more income in a month than Gary had earned in his best year of employment. The irony was so perfect it was almost artistic. While they were plotting to steal my modest house to solve their financial problems, I was sitting on resources that could solve their problems 1,000 times over. If they had simply been honest with me about their situation, if they had treated me with respect and asked for help instead of trying to take control, I might have been willing to assist them. But they had chosen deception, manipulation, and theft instead of honesty. They had treated me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a family member to include. They had dismissed my intelligence, ignored my autonomy, and planned my future without my input. Now they were going to discover exactly how expensive it could be to underestimate a woman like me. I began making lists of evidence I needed to gather, of legal steps I should take, of financial moves that would protect my assets and demonstrate my competence. But more than that, I began planning for the moment when I would reveal the truth about who they had been stealing from. I wanted that moment to be perfect. I wanted them to understand not just that they had been caught, but that they had made the worst possible mistake in choosing me as their victim. I wanted them to realize that the confused old woman they thought they were manipulating was actually someone who could change their lives with a single phone call, and not necessarily for the better. The planning felt good. For the first time in months, I was thinking strategically again, using the skills that had made me successful in business to solve a personal problem. I was remembering who I really was beneath the layers of imposed dependency and manufactured helplessness. I was Lorna Morrison, successful entrepreneur and self-made millionaire, and I was about to remind everyone else of that fact too. The opportunity I had been waiting for presented itself on a Thursday morning in early October. I was in the basement, supposedly napping, when I heard Gary on the phone with what sounded like a real estate agent. His voice carried clearly through the thin ceiling as he discussed showing schedules and closing timelines with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had every right to be making these arrangements. "Yeah, we can do Saturday afternoon," he was saying. "The old lady will be out of the way. She usually takes a long nap around that time anyway." The old lady. After 8 months of living in my house, eating my food, and spending my money, I had been reduced to the old lady in conversations about selling my property. "The basement situation is temporary," Gary continued. "She'll be in assisted living within the month, so that won't be an issue for the new owners. They can convert that space however they want." Within the month. They weren't just planning anymore, they were implementing. They had apparently settled on a timeline for my institutionalization without bothering to inform me. But instead of the despair I might have felt a few weeks earlier, I experienced something much more powerful: absolute certainty. The time for planning was over. Gary's casual dismissal of my existence had just triggered my point of no return. That afternoon, while Gabrielle was at work and Gary was out job hunting, which I now knew meant meeting friends at the sports bar, I began executing the plan I had been developing. My first call was to my attorney, Alvin Brennan, who had handled Archie's estate and knew me as a competent businesswoman rather than a declining elderly relative. "Lorna," he said warmly when his secretary put me through. "How are you doing? I haven't heard from you since we finalized the business sale paperwork." "I'm well, Alvin, but I need your help with a delicate family matter." I outlined the situation carefully, focusing on the legal facts rather than the emotional betrayal. "I need to protect my assets and establish clear documentation of my mental competence before this goes any further." Alvin's tone shifted to professional concern. "Lorna, what you're describing sounds like textbook financial elder abuse. Have you considered involving law enforcement?" "Not yet," I said. "I want to handle this privately first, but I need to ensure I have legal protection if they escalate their efforts." "Absolutely. Can you come in tomorrow morning? We should update your will, establish a living trust if you're interested, and document your current mental state with formal cognitive assessments. I can also prepare cease and desist orders regarding any property transactions." My second call was to my financial advisor, who had been managing the investment side of my wealth while I focused on the business operations. "I need liquid access. To a substantial amount of capital, I told him. Possibly as much as $10 million. That's not a problem, Mrs. Morrison, he replied. Should I move funds from your money market accounts, or do you want to liquidate some of the bond portfolio? Money market is fine, and I'll need official documentation of my net worth and asset holdings. Something comprehensive that a layperson could understand. My third call was to my accountant, requesting detailed financial statements for both my personal assets and Meridian Digital Solutions. I need everything that demonstrates the scope of my holdings, I explained. Think of it as documentation for someone who might question my financial competence. Mrs. Morrison, she said carefully. Is everything all right? This sounds like you're preparing for some kind of legal challenge. Preventive measures, I assured her. I just want to have comprehensive documentation available if needed. My final call was to Dr. Patricia Chen, my physician, requesting a complete physical and cognitive evaluation. I need formal documentation of my mental and physical capabilities, I explained. Family reasons. Dr. Chen didn't ask for details, but her tone suggested she understood the implications. Can you come in tomorrow afternoon? I'll arrange for a full workup, including cognitive assessments and a geriatric psychiatrist consultation if you'd like independent verification of your mental acuity. By Friday evening, I had assembled a comprehensive portfolio that documented my competence, my wealth, and my legal rights. The cognitive assessments showed mental function well above average for any age group. The financial statements revealed assets exceeding $1.8 billion. The legal documents established my exclusive ownership of the house and my right to make decisions about my property and living situation. But more than just gathering defensive documentation, I had also prepared my offensive strategy. I had researched Gary's employment history, Gabrielle's financial obligations, and their debt situation. I had documented every unauthorized credit card charge, every unpaid loan, and every household expense they had shifted to me without consultation. Most importantly, I had prepared the revelation that would change everything. I had printed financial statements, business summaries, and asset documentation in a format that would be immediately comprehensible to people who had never seen wealth at this scale. I wanted them to understand not just that they had been wrong about my circumstances, but how spectacularly wrong they had been. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They thought they were taking advantage of a helpless old woman who depended on their charity. I would show them that they had been living off the charity of one of the wealthiest women in the state. They assumed I had no options but to accept their decisions about my future. I would demonstrate that I had more options than they could imagine, including options that could dramatically affect their future. But the centerpiece of my plan was the timing. I wouldn't reveal my true circumstances until they asked me for money again, which, based on their patterns, would happen within days. When they approached me for another loan or contribution, when they sat in my basement and treated me like a convenient ATM while planning to institutionalize me, I would give them exactly what they deserved, the shock of their lives. Saturday morning, as I listened to them preparing for another house showing, discussing my future as if I were an object to be disposed of rather than a person with rights and preferences, I felt perfectly calm. Everything was ready. The documentation was assembled. The strategy was clear. All I had to do now was wait for them to give me the perfect opening to change their lives forever. The moment came on Sunday evening, exactly as I had predicted. I was sitting in the basement, supposedly watching television, when I heard their footsteps descending the stairs. Both of them were coming down together, which meant this was going to be a serious conversation, the kind where they presented a united front to convince the old lady to be reasonable about whatever they needed from her this time. "Mom," Gabrielle said as they reached the bottom of the stairs, her voice carrying that particular tone of strained patience I had come to recognize. "We need to talk to you about something important." Gary positioned himself slightly behind her, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who was prepared to be the bad guy if necessary. They had clearly rehearsed this conversation, planned their approach, decided on their strategy for managing my expected resistance. "Of course, dear," I said, muting the television and giving them my full attention. "What's on your mind?" Gabrielle sat down on the edge of my narrow bed, uninvited, while Gary remained standing. The physical positioning was deliberate. She was the caring daughter trying to connect with me. He was the practical son-in-law who would enforce whatever decision they had reached. "We've been thinking a lot about your situation," Gabrielle began, "and we're really concerned about your future security. This house is so much work to maintain, and as you get older, it's going to become more and more difficult to manage." I nodded encouragingly, as if this was the first time I was hearing these concerns rather than the 10th. "We found a really nice assisted living community," she continued. "Meadowbrook Manor. It's clean, the staff seems caring, and they have activities designed for people your age. You'd have your own room, meals provided, medical care on site." "It sounds lovely," I said mildly. "I'm sure it's quite expensive, though." "Well, that's where we have a solution," Gary interjected, stepping forward as if he couldn't contain himself any longer. "We've had the house appraised, and we can get enough from the sale to cover several years at Meadowbrook. Plus, pay off some of the family debts." Family debts. As if their credit card bills were somehow my responsibility. "The thing is," Gabrielle said, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that was supposed to seem comforting, "we need about $15,000 to get everything arranged. The moving costs, the deposits for Meadowbrook, some repairs the house needs before we can list it. We were hoping you could help us with that." And there it was. The perfect opening I had been waiting for. They wanted me to pay for my own exile. $15,000, I repeated thoughtfully. That is quite a bit of money. "We know it's a lot to ask," Gabrielle said quickly. "But it's really an investment in your future comfort and security. And we'll pay you back from the house. Sale, of course." Of course they would, just like they had paid back all the other loans. "I appreciate that you're thinking about my future," I said, standing up and walking over to my small desk where I had placed the folder containing all my documentation. "But before we discuss this any further, I think there are some things you should know about my actual financial situation." I opened the folder and removed the first document, a summary of my assets prepared by my accountant. "You seem to be under the impression that I'm struggling financially, that I need you to manage my affairs because I can't handle them myself." Gary glanced at the papers in my hand with mild interest, probably expecting to see bank statements showing a few $1,000 in savings. "The truth is," I continued, "I'm worth approximately $1.8 billion. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Gabrielle's expression didn't change immediately. The number was too large for her to process. Gary's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching panic. "What?" Gabrielle said finally. I handed her the asset summary. "This is a comprehensive overview of my holdings. As you can see, I own a company called Meridian Digital Solutions, which I've been building for the past 5 years. It's currently valued at just over $1.2 billion. I also have personal investments worth approximately $600 million. Gabrielle stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. Gary grabbed it from her hands, his eyes scanning the numbers with increasing desperation. "This can't be real," he said. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "It's quite real," I assured him. "I've been running this business from my laptop while you've been living upstairs, planning to sell my house and institutionalize me. While you've been treating me like a burden who couldn't manage her own affairs, I've been managing a business empire that employs over 800 people." The silence that followed my revelation lasted exactly 17 seconds. I counted them. Then, Gary exploded into action like a man whose life depended on damage control. "This is insane," he said, waving the financial statements in the air. "These documents have to be fake. Old people get scammed all the time with investment schemes." "Mom, someone has obviously taken advantage of you." I watched him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. Even when confronted with irrefutable evidence, his first instinct was to maintain the fiction that I was incompetent. "The documents are quite real," I said calmly. "You're welcome to call my attorney, Alvin Brennan, to verify them. His number is on the letterhead." Gabrielle was still staring at the papers, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. But how? When? We would have known if you had this kind of money." "Would you?" I asked. "You've been so convinced that I'm declining mentally that you never bothered to ask what I actually do when I'm on my computer. You assumed I was playing solitaire or reading email. It never occurred to you that I might be conducting business." Gary began pacing the small basement space like a caged animal. "Even if this is real, and I'm not saying it is, it doesn't change anything. You still need care. You still can't manage a house this size at your age." "According to whom?" I reached into the folder and pulled out Dr. Chen's medical evaluation. "Here's a comprehensive physical and cognitive assessment completed just yesterday. As you can see, I'm in excellent health for my age, and my cognitive function tests in the 95th percentile for all age groups." "Mom," Gabrielle said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, "even if you have been successful with some investments, you still need family support. You still need people who care about you making sure you're safe." "Like you've been doing?" I asked. "By moving me to the basement? By using my credit cards without permission? By planning to sell my house and institutionalize me without my knowledge or consent?" Gary stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting to something more calculating. "Look, if you really have this kind of money, then you can afford the best care available. We were just trying to find something we could manage financially. Now we can look at better options." "We?" I repeated. "There is no we in this decision, Gary. There never was. This is my life, my house, and my money. You have no legal standing to make decisions about any of it." "But we're family," Gabrielle protested. "Families take care of each other. We've been taking care of you." "You've been taking care of yourselves," I corrected. "You moved into my house to solve your housing problem. You've been borrowing my money to solve your debt problems. You plan to sell my property to solve your financial problems. At what point in this arrangement was my welfare the primary concern?" The fight was going out of Gabrielle as the reality of the situation sank in, but Gary was doubling down. "You can't just kick us out," he said. "We have a baby. We have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem," I replied. "You're both adults. You're both capable of working. The fact that you've chosen to live off my charity for 8 months instead of solving your own problems doesn't create an obligation on my part to continue supporting you." "But the house sale," Gary started. "There will be no house sale," I interrupted. "I've had my attorney prepare cease and desist orders regarding any attempts to list or sell this property. If you've made any commitments to real estate agents, you'll need to cancel them immediately." Gary's face was flushed now, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. You can't just change everything overnight. We have plans. We have arrangements." "You made plans about my property without my consent," I said. "Those plans are void. Any arrangements you made regarding my future are canceled. Any commitments you've made based on the assumption that you could control my assets are your problem to resolve." "You're being unreasonable," Gabrielle said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "We're trying to help you. We love you." "If you loved me," I said quietly, "you would have included me in decisions about my own life. You would have asked what I wanted instead of deciding what was best for me. You would have treated me like a person instead of a problem to be managed." The basement fell silent again, except for the sound of Gary's heavy breathing and Gabrielle's sniffling. They were beginning to understand that their carefully constructed plan had just collapsed completely, but they weren't ready to accept the new reality. That was fine. they would have plenty of time to adjust to it. 3 months later, I stood in the master bedroom of my own house for the first time in almost a year, watching a team of professional movers carefully position the antique armoire that Archie and I had bought for our 20th anniversary. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that I had forgotten offered such a beautiful view of the neighborhood I had helped build. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed, structurally, but because I was different. I moved through these rooms with the confidence of someone who belonged here, who had earned the right to be here, who would never again allow anyone to make me feel like a guest in my own home. After that confrontation in the basement, things had moved quickly. Gabrielle and Gary had exactly 30 days to find alternative housing, a timeline I had extended to 60 days when I realized that little Rudy shouldn't suffer for his parents' poor choices. I had even provided them with the first month's rent and security deposit for a decent apartment across town, though I made it clear this was a one-time gift, not the beginning of ongoing financial support. To their credit, they had accepted the new reality with better grace than I had expected. Gabrielle had been genuinely shocked to learn about my business success, and once the initial hurt and embarrassment faded, she seemed almost proud. Gary had been harder to convince, but when his attempts to claim a right to family money were firmly rebuffed by my attorney, he had grudgingly begun applying for actual jobs. The most surprising development had been the improvement in my relationship with my grandson. Now that I wasn't relegated to the basement and relegated to the role of convenient babysitter, Rudy and I had begun building a genuine connection. He visited every Saturday afternoon, and I had converted the guest room into a proper space for him. Age-appropriate toys, books, and activities that reflected my actual interest in his development rather than just my availability as free childcare. But the real transformation had been in my own life. With the house back under my control, I had finally been able to create a proper home office that reflected the scope of my business operations. The room that had once been Gary's video game headquarters now housed multiple monitors, professional-grade telecommunications equipment, and the kind of workspace that a billion-dollar enterprise deserved. I had also begun to emerge from the secrecy that had characterized my business activities. The local business community had been stunned to discover that one of the state's most successful entrepreneurs had been living quietly in their midst. I had been invited to join several corporate boards, speak at business conferences, and mentor other older adults who were interested in starting their own companies. The validation was intoxicating, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't the recognition itself that felt so good. It was the return to being seen as competent, valuable, and worthy of respect. After months of being treated as if my opinions didn't matter and my capabilities were questionable, being sought out for my expertise and judgment felt like coming back to life. Most surprisingly, I had reconnected with old friends who had faded from my life during the months when I was trapped in the basement. Invitations to social events had resumed when people realized I was available and interested in participating. Business associates who had assumed I was fully retired began reaching out about potential collaborations and investments. The woman who had felt invisible and forgotten discovered that she had never really disappeared. She had just been hidden by circumstances that were now completely under her control. My 74th birthday party, held in my own dining room with my own guest list, had been a celebration not just of another year of life, but of the reclamation of my identity and autonomy. The basement had been converted into a proper recreation room, a space for entertaining rather than exile. Standing in my reclaimed bedroom, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. I had proven to myself and everyone else that age was not synonymous with incompetence, that being a grandmother didn't mean surrendering personhood, and that it was never too late to stand up for yourself. Today marked exactly 1 year since that terrible Tuesday when I had overheard Gabrielle referring to me as the previous owner of my own home. As I prepared for our weekly family dinner, now held in my dining room, with me as the host rather than the basement-dwelling afterthought, I reflected on how completely our relationships had transformed. The doorbell rang precisely at 6 o'clock. Punctuality had become important to Gabrielle and Gary since they no longer took my time for granted. When I opened the door, Rudy launched himself into my arms with the enthusiasm of a child who knew he was genuinely wanted, not just tolerated, out of obligation. "Grandma Lorna, I brought you something." He held up a crayon drawing that appeared to depict a woman in a business suit standing next to a very tall building. "It's you at your company?" "It's perfect," I said, meaning it. The fact that my 2-year-old grandson now understood that his grandmother ran a business felt like a victory in itself. Gabrielle and Gary followed him in, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine, gestures that would have been unthinkable during their months as entitled houseguests. Gabrielle looked healthier than she had in years, the stress lines around her eyes softened by what I recognized as the relief of people who were finally taking responsibility for their own lives. "How's the new job working out?" I asked Gary as we settled in the living room with pre-dinner drinks. "Better than I expected," he admitted. "The marketing director position at Henderson Industries is actually challenging. It feels good to be contributing again instead of just waiting around." It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging how thoroughly he had squandered the months when I was supporting his family. I appreciated the honesty, even if it had taken him this long to achieve it. "And how are things with your students this year?" I asked Gabrielle, who had returned to her teaching position with renewed energy once the stress of their financial crisis had been resolved. "Wonderful. I'm actually enjoying it again now that I'm not constantly worried about money." She paused, then added, "I wanted to thank you again for helping us get settled in the apartment, and for the loan that paid off our credit cards." The loan, $25,000 that I had provided with clear terms and a formal repayment schedule, had eliminated their debt crisis and given them a fresh start. Unlike their previous borrowing, this was a legitimate business transaction with documentation and accountability. "You've been making payments right on schedule," I noted. "That means a lot to me." What meant even more was the way they now treated me as an equal rather than a dependent. They asked for my opinions instead of making assumptions about what I needed. They included me in conversations instead of talking around me. They respected my time instead of treating it as infinitely available. During dinner, Gabrielle brought up the topic that had been on my mind all week. "Mom, I know this is probably difficult to talk about, but I owe you an apology that's long overdue." I set down my fork and gave her my full attention. "I was so convinced that you needed taking care of that, I never stopped to actually look at what you were capable of," she continued. "I made assumptions about aging that were completely wrong. I treated you like you were becoming incompetent when you were actually more successful than you'd ever been." "We both did," Gary added quietly. "We saw what we expected to see instead of what was actually there." "What matters," I said, "is that you learned from it, and that you're raising Rudy to see older people as individuals rather than just problems to be managed." As if summoned by his name, Rudy climbed into my lap, sticky fingers and all. "Grandma, when I'm big like Daddy, will you teach me about business?" "Absolutely," I promised. "But first, let's focus on you learning to tie your shoes." We all laughed, and for the first time in over a year, it felt like we were truly a family again. Not a collection of people managing each other's limitations, but individuals who chose to care for each other from positions of mutual respect. After they left, I sat in my reclaimed living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was fully my own once again. Tomorrow, I would continue building Meridian Digital Solutions. I would mentor other entrepreneurs, serve on corporate boards, and prove that the most productive years of a life might come when others least expect them. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be Lorna Morrison, successful businesswoman, loving grandmother, and woman who had learned that it's never Too late to reclaim your power and demand the respect you deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.